delighted, of course, to welcome two old friends back for this discussion. And we've got Father Tom Hurley, who, as many of you already know, Pastor Emeritus of Old St. Patrick's, and who is currently working with the Marist community. What do we call you? The most active alum? No.
The most active alum,
The most active alum of the Marist community. And of course, we also have Rabbi Evan Moffic, who's the head of the Macomb Salel congregation in Lakeside, and a frequent speaker with us here. What we're going to do, we do have a couple of questions that we prepared that we'll use to kick off the discussion today, and then we will open it up for questions because we do want it to be a discussion, and I know it's something that's probably on the minds of all of you as you navigate these conversations with family and friends. So as we get it kicked off, I mean, this is something that, you know, obviously with the Hamas terrorist attack that happened on October 7th, many of us have talked about the situation with our extended family and friends, and it's complex and it's emotional. And as the conflict continues, as it prolongs, as the numbers, the humanitarian crisis deepens, I think the last statistics I saw were 25,000 Palestinians. The conversation gets even more difficult. So I think the first question I have is, how have you been addressing the conflict with your congregations on both sides of the aisles? Because I'm sure you're getting questions about, what does this mean? Where is it going? How can this be justified? So, Evan, do you want to take a first pass at that?
Okay. Oh, that's good. Okay. Oh, yeah. This has been a tremendous issue for me, my congregation, the larger Jewish community over the last, since October 7th, and it certainly has changed and shifted how we process it. I think in the first few weeks, it was just, total horror and a feeling of trauma. In violation. I mean, it's the most Jews killed since any day during the Holocaust. So, and I mean, you hear people in Israel say it was the worst day in Israel's history. September 11th times 10 or 100, and on a per capita population scale. So it was just tremendously painful and hard, and it's gotten even harder to a degree because we do have many people in the congregation who have family and friends who are actually serving in the army in Israel. So, so there is a not only a kind of broader religious identification with the with what's with the Jewish people, but a real personal connection to people serving. So that's happening. And then there's another level, which is the rise in anti-Semitism around the world, with marches that seem to glorify Hamas and glorify violence. So that's made people feel scared, and the rise in anti-Semitic incidents in the United States and at synagogues. I mean, and so that has created a real culture of fear. I know there are several synagogues that have seen drops in religious school attendance since October 7th. We haven't. But we're in the suburbs, so it's a little bit different. I'm sure the urban congregations here have had probably more issues than we have. So that's another level. And then the third level, which I think all of us are aware of and which was alluded to, is just the sort of horror of war. And I don't think anybody is happy about 25,000 Palestinians being killed. I mean, that's just any right person, anyone who cares about humanity. Nobody is not celebrating that. So how do we process this tremendous loss? Not to mention, obviously, the number of Israelis killed is much less. But the soldiers. I mean, the tremendous loss of life of Israelis has not been this horrible since the Yom Kippur War 50 years ago. So there's just this, how do you process this tremendous loss of life? And I think that is really just gnawing at people's souls, and then a general sense of hopelessness, like, how does this end? How do we process the ending, and what happens to the hostages? Are hostages still alive? And so there's just this tremendous sense of fear and loss, and really a sense of hopelessness. I really, usually I try to look for the silver lining in things, and there does not seem to be a silver lining here. Just to be blunt, I mean, in America, we obviously, as an American Jewish community, interfaith couples, we are insulated from a lot of the horror going on. So I think that's a blessing. But from what's happening in Israel, it's just a lot more questions than answers.
Tom, would love your perspective too. The questions you might be getting.
Yeah, well, obviously, I'm probably not as intensely involved in conversations or preaching as Evan would be. Obviously, in a Jewish community, in a synagogue, or in a gathering in a community. But I've come at it, and I've approached it from I guess my own experience of having gone to the Holy Land. And when I was pastor here, I had the good fortune of going 4 times to the Holy Land. And, and it was 2009 was my first experience of going over there. And we were strictly in Israel, going up to Galilee first, the Galilee region, and then around this, we call it Tiberias, I guess, and then coming down into Jerusalem and out to the Dead Sea and all that good stuff. And I guess before that, I had been somewhat knowledgeable of, the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. But I tell you, it's a lot different when you're there. And, I grew up on the south side of Chicago, and sadly, the reality of racism is sadly alive. I wouldn't say alive and well, because nothing's well. It's alive. And I grew up with it. I heard of it. I saw it. And people making comments, and the dislike, based strictly on the color of somebody's skin. I mean, it was obviously, it's jarring, it's sad, it's a sin against humanity. And then to go there, and to experience really the disdain and the dislike between Israelis and Palestinians is really just a sad situation. And I'll tell you just one experience. When I was there in 2009, I had, again, a group here, and I think the max out was like 45 people on the trip. We had a Palestinian guide who was guiding us, and a Palestinian driver. And we went to all the various holy sites, as you can imagine, including, the wall, the Western Wall. And but when we were up in Galilee, of course, all the Chicagoans, St. Pat's people had their credit cards out, and they were just ready to burn them, and to buy all sorts of various religious articles and olive wood and you name it. And this Palestinian guide was like, hey guys, could you wait? Could you wait until we get to Bethlehem? And I thought, what? And he kept saying it a couple times, like, hey, could you wait? Could you hold off a little bit? And wait till we get to Bethlehem. And I thought, what's the big deal here? And then we finally drove down right outside Jerusalem. Bethlehem's kind of a suburb of Jerusalem, And then I saw the barbed wire and the wall. And I thought, okay, now I think I know what's going on here. And then we get into this store that he wanted us to go into. And the owner of the store came up to me and thanked me for bringing these people to his store. And he said, Father, thank you so much. He said, please encourage other people to come here. He said, we're really in a tough way here. He said, in Bethlehem today, it's 52% unemployment. That was back in 2009. More than half the people are unemployed. And but he said to me, I know that the message you get in the United States is that Palestinians are Hamas. He said, we are not Hamas. He said, we don't agree with them. We are not them. We're just people that want to live in solidarity and in peace. And I'll never forget him saying that. And so having experienced that, and then having gone back 3 more times, and just to see it and to see and experience the both verbal exchange and there was one time we were in, I forgot where we were, but we were at a restaurant, and we were actually flying home on a red eye that night from Tel Aviv, and the guide said, okay, everybody, I don't want to, he came up to me and said, I don't want to scare everybody, but like finish up, like we're getting on the bus and getting out of here because there was some conflict that had erupted and we got to get out of here, and we got to make our way up to Tel Aviv to get to the airport. And so we did that, and but I tell you, I just, obviously when I heard about it, like all of you, I mean, it's horrifying, it's shocking, it's as you said, it's crimes against humanity. And it's the human family that just has this terrible hatred and this terrible violence. And, but to see it, it's like, I don't know. I guess when I was invited to do this, I'm at a loss for words, like all of you. It's just downright sadness. I don't know where the resolutions or where the peace is going to come from. I really don't. On one hand, I can fully understand the Jewish-Israeli experience of we're done with this Hamas stuff. We're done with the terrorism. I get it. But I also understand from having seen it, and again, I'm not a scholar on it, but it's just more from being there and understanding just the basics. It's just a terrible hatred, and somehow, some way, it's got to end.
What I know this group in particular, many of them have younger children, but what, Evan, I'll start with you on this one. What advice are you giving? Can you give this group on how to talk about the conflict? Because, as I said at the top, it's extremely complicated. So where do you recommend that? And kids are seeing it or they're hearing about it, but what do you recommend, or how do you recommend they tackle it with children of all ages? And maybe we'll start with younger children.
I mean, obviously, yeah, you have to be kind of age appropriate. I would try. It's so complex, and so I think you have to kind of simplify, and just to say, these are there is violence and there is anger and there's not there's people that believe they should live in the same place, and they're fighting over it, and there's a lot of people that want peace. There are people who truly want to heal, as Father Tom alluded to, but there are also people that want to continue fighting. And so we just, as I would say to kids, we just want to do our best to promote peace, and we're safe here. Obviously, you want to reinforce that we're safe here, and we're doing our best to promote peace for the people we love who are there. And I think that's the best we can do. And as they get older, they'll probably ask similar questions that we all have. And I think that is that's important. And I think empathy. I mean, obviously, as a rabbi, as someone who loves Israel, spent a year there, I'm deeply pained by what's happening, and empathetic, and agree with the mission to destroy Hamas. But I also, I can put myself in the shoes of a Palestinian and realize what a horrible card they've been dealt in life. I mean, it's I think we should, it is to grow up as a Palestinian with, there was a sort of a famous Jewish one-liner by one of the early foreign ministers of Israel named Abba Eban, who was originally from England, and he said the Palestinians have never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity, and it's a very sad. Palestinians have had a horrible fate. Many did lose the homes that their families had lived in. But at every turn, at every opportunity to kind of have some sort of peace, it's been rejected. And then I think this act of October 7th has set things back decades. I mean, the number of Israelis now who support a two-state solution, I think, is like under 10%. It's incredible how there's a feeling that we could never live in peace. Maybe if there's sort of a minimal kind of administrated Palestinian area, okay, maybe, but the kind of living side by side two-state that people dreamed about in Oslo Accords 30 years ago, I think that's almost like a seen as a pipe as a utopia now. So I think this has set things back, so far. I mean, things were not good beforehand, but I think it's gotten even worse.
And Father Tom, the high school. I mean, you interact with high schoolers on a daily basis. Have they had questions? How have you talked to them about it?
Well, funny you should say that, because about a week and a half ago, I was sitting in the student life office, and it's right off the cafeteria, and there's just a group of students that often come in there and sit in there and have lunch with each other and the campus ministers, and I just happened to be in there that day, and normally it's seniors, because only seniors allowed, and no one else is cool enough to be in there except seniors. And but it was interesting. We were very interesting on this eve of tomorrow. Tomorrow in this world, in the Catholic world, it's the Catholic Schools Week, and so celebrating the gift and the mission of Catholic schools. And so I was in there for a meeting with the campus ministers, like trying to get ready for this liturgy tomorrow. And one of the things that we did is we just, in an impromptu conversation, we started asking them about their knowledge or their connectedness to what's going on in the Holy Land.
Yeah.
And likewise, what is going on with the migrant situation here, particularly in Chicago, but in the United States. And it was sad in terms of the lack of awareness. And there's somewhat aware. Some of the kids were aware of it, but there was I was surprised and shocked by the I'm going to go so far as to say the ignorance of the severity of what's going on. And I think in many ways, shame on us. Shame on us as the adults. Shame on us as a school, particularly a Catholic school, that should be more direct, and we should be educating these kids. They're the next generation. Because if it's not even just knowledge of Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what about, if you will, kind of the new emergence of racism, of anti-Venezuelan, and anti-migrant that's going on. And I just think it's not helpful for us to be living with blinders on, or to be living in these silos where that's their problem.
Right. Not in my
No, it's not their problem. Yeah. It's all of our problem. And it's a problem that is the problem of humanity, the human family. And shame on us if we're not educating the next generation in terms of the basics of what we both believe. It's about love, it's about reverencing the human community. And so shame on us in many ways, but the task is before us, and we have to do this for the next generation. But again, I
agree 100%. It's shame on us, and I see the same thing. But on the other hand, it's so complex. It's almost so much more tempting to kind of, we've got enough. Adolescence is hard enough, as it is. And having gone through COVID, 3-4 years ago, I mean, it's just, I feel for teenagers, and I mean, I have two of them myself. I mean, I feel it is just so much to handle, and I mean, I'm looking around. Probably most of us didn't grow up with social media and Instagram, and it's just it's an overwhelmingly hard time.
And you're right. I mean, there's the Ukraine-Russia war. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on that people have to digest. But Evan, I'm going to go back to a question that we had previously, but I want to revisit it here. There's kind of an assumption that if you're Jewish in America, that you're a supporter of the Jewish state. But before this conflict erupted, there were already a lot of people questioning the political situation, Netanyahu and his alignment with the far left. So what are your thoughts on how that's changed? I mean, we hear in the media, and maybe this is part of how we talk about this with our kids too, is that because there is this whole rise of extremism, and in some ways it didn't start in Israel, but that was certainly something that was top of mind for people before October 7th.
I think it's important, and I think this is actually very important especially in an interfaith kind of setting, to sort of understand and acknowledge that there have always been tremendous divisions among Jews, just like there are divisions among Catholics. I mean, there have been tremendous divisions among the Jewish people in terms of, orthodoxy and reform is one. Yeah. But even within Israel, a kind of, should Israel be a strictly religious Jewish state, which it is not. It sometimes appears that way, but in general, Israel is a secular Jewish democracy. Now, that is sort of almost a contradiction in terms, and that would be a subject for a whole nother class to understand what that means. But in general, what it means is Israel is not a really strictly religious state. But there are many people who want it to be that way. And so there are tremendous divisions within Israel, just as there are tremendous divisions within the American Jewish community. And I think we were seeing that tension play out before October 7th, really centering around Supreme Court, the role of the Supreme Court in Israel. And that, I think, affected, most people, I think, in an interfaith community and in a Reform Jewish community are pretty more on the left in terms of Israel should be a more secular democracy. And I think, yes, that certainly played a role in what's happened. But I think that tension has obviously been sort of put aside since October 7th, or at least kind of, tabled for the time being, in that, during times of crisis, people come together and focus on their shared interests. Just like, after September 11th, at least for a period of time in the United States, political divisions, were kind of put aside. I'm sure those will come back, right, obviously, and I think they already are. I think we're seeing a real tension in Israel right now about what to do regarding the hostages, because I think that is such a painful issue for Israel. This actually goes back to Jewish law. There's always been a very strong concept in Jewish tradition, Jewish law, about redeeming captives, that you will pay people should be willing to pay a high price to free someone who has been taken captive. This goes back to the medieval period in Jewish history. So there are people who say we should do everything we can to rescue the hostages. And then there are people who say, well, the only way we can rescue hostages is constantly further bombing, so that, there's a feeling that the only thing we can do now is return hostages. So that tension is emerging in Israel. And I think that will continue. And I think as the war kind of shifts, we'll see a bit more of those kind of left-right tensions. And I think people were worried about Israel's future even before October 7th. And I think those worries on an ideological level will return.
Yeah, I think, the other thing, and obviously I said left, and I meant the far right, with the alignment with the far right. Do you think, as you look further down the road, where do we see the path to reconciliation, or where do you see this, from a personal perspective, where do you see this ending? Some people
between the far right and the far left, or
between Netanyahu and his alliance with the far right. It seems like the Israelis have lost confidence to a certain extent in him. I mean, there were already questions after the terrorism attack about how could this possibly happen? Most sophisticated, security system, a security department. But what, where do you think confidence lies right now?
Oh yeah, I think the far right sort of. Well, I think Netanyahu is he's a very political figure. He's sort of very, he's a very smart man on a intellectual, political level, very pragmatic, and I think he probably recognizes that his career is over because this tremendous failure happened under his watch. So in some ways, he's incentivized to have the war go further. So I think that's a whole nother. Again, I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but that there is that sort of potential. I think I think the role of the far right will decline in Israel, at least on a political level, because aside from the fact of this attack leading to so many deaths in one day, aside from that kind of trauma, I think there's a different sort of trauma in that Israel and the world, including American Jews, saw Israel as almost like this impenetrable fortress, this incredibly strong military with incredible intelligence, almost in some ways glorifying, which in certain areas, I just was reading something. This was the one of the anniversaries of this hostage rescue at Entebbe in 1976, where it was actually Bibi Netanyahu's brother was killed, where several hostages were taken on an Air France right around July 4th, 1976, 200th anniversary of America, and these hostages were freed by an Israeli commando force. And it was seen as this sort of, there was a book written about it called The Miracle at Entebbe. So this tremendously successful, almost miraculous rescue. So there was this sense that Israel is incredibly smart, invulnerable, and then to see that this almost a loss of control over a few hours was very difficult for the Israeli psyche in a sense of what happened. How did this incredibly powerful, smart, capable military get knocked out by guys riding in on paragliders and dirt bikes?
Yeah.
So I think that the impact of that will happen after the war is over, and I think it will hurt the far right, which I think will probably be a good thing in the long run for Israel.
And then, just as we think about kind of the I'm thinking about the ideology, the whole ideology, and I'm going to go back, Father Tom, to your comment earlier about, Palestinians versus the Jews, and that whole commentary. Part of the reason, and this is one of the questions that I think some of us have to address too, is this actually going? And is this going to work? Can you kill an ideology, right? Because people say that what Hamas believe is an ideology. And so is the war futile in a sense, because you're never going to wipe it out, because there will always be people who believe, and talk about the next generation, they believe what they believe, they pass it on to their kids, and it just falls down through the generations. What are your thoughts on whether or not this is, whether can you wipe out an ideology? Tricky question. Tom's like,
Oh, you're asking me?
yeah. Give it.
Go for it.
Well, I don't know the answer, but I don't know that there's an alternative to doing something. I don't know if, I doubt it. I don't think you can wipe out an ideology, but I don't think that I think that people in Israel are saying, well, you could make the argument, well, you can't wipe out Nazi ideology, so then should we not fight Nazis? So I think that's sort of it may be true to a degree that this kind of incredible violence, this hatred can't be wiped out, but I don't think Israel sees any alternative than to try. And I think that probably if I had to be if I was a betting man in some ways, I do think the United States idea of the Palestinian Authority returning to control in Gaza, just like they are sort of in control in the West Bank, is probably the long-term solution. And the Palestinian Authority is kind of hated by a lot of Palestinians because they're very corrupt and they're seen as in bed with Israel, because that is true. I mean, Israel funds the Palestinian Authority effectively, and that and it trains the police force and so forth. But I think that is the idea that Hamas would have some sort of political power and governmental legitimacy. I think that's sort of off the table. So I don't think you can destroy an ideology, but I think the sort of change in government structure is probably the closest we'll get.
But I like that. I like that idea that you're right. You can't kill an ideology, but we have to do something. So this is the something, even if we don't fully support the humanitarian piece of it. I also wanted to understand, and again, something that we may be feeling, the media has a huge role to play in how we talk about the war and the shift of sympathies, for and against, as it were. So, for example, immediately in the aftermath of October 7th, there was a lot of sympathy for Israel. I see that over the last few months, there's been a shift in that sympathy. And certainly as the humanitarian toll rises, it continues to shift. What are your thoughts on, it's interesting. So from I grew up in Ireland, and I would say that the Europeans are much more sympathetic to the Palestinians than they are to the Jewish and Israeli state. But what are your, as you look across the media, what are your observations on how the media is handling it and or how that's swaying public opinion?
Well, I don't know in terms of the, I'm not knowledgeable enough to talk about the media, but I mean, I think how can you not be sympathetic in the aftermath of the atrocities of October 7th, just as, the whole world, was sympathetic and came around us after the atrocities of September 11th, 9/11. And, but then, it's like the same thing has happened. I mean, look what we did, we went in and, Bush just continued to, go further and further, into these Muslim areas. So to a point where, we kind of lost some sympathy. We lost some credibility. And so, again, I want to, I'm not as knowledgeable on this stuff, but, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, it just seems like Netanyahu and, Israel has a mission, and their mission is to wipe out, Hamas. And terrorists should be wiped out. I'm going to go back to your previous question about, ideologies. How do you get rid of ideologies? I don't know. But it's the question of evil, how do you wipe out evil in the world? We do our best. We continue this mission of love, and I know that might sound a little trite or Pollyannish, but but I mean, how do we continue? We have to continue. We can't just let it go. I mean, how do we confront racism? How do we confront terrorism? How do you confront all these various isms that destroy the human family? Well, I mean, again, we're religious leaders, and though at times even our own organizations are not what they should be, and leadership is not what it should be, I believe that we are here because we share this common bond, and this common bond of how do we continue to teach and to proclaim the beauty of our traditions and what God imagined for the world. It's not what Hamas imagines, or it's not what racism imagined, or Nazism, whatever. I mean, that's evil. That is evil. So I mean, how do we confront evil? Right. We can't just sit back, but we need to continue to be a voice. That's why we're doing this. It's why we're having a conversation today.
But maybe I think you've probably hit on something, because as we think about what can we do in our daily lives or in the conversations that we're having, I think there is a piece of it, which is have the conversation. And I love when you talk about the human family, right? Because the human family isn't any one religion. It's multiple religions, it's multiple races, it's multiple everything. And I think taking that nugget away is also really powerful. Evan, you were going to...
I want to echo. I mean, I think both sides. I like to listen to different podcasts and read different books from all different points of view, including the Palestinian points of view. And both sides see tremendous media bias. I mean, this is, and I do think the media plays a terrible, terrible role in every dimension in this conflict. Because actually, this is somewhat of a religious idea. We're in the Jewish Torah reading cycle. We're just finishing up right now the story of Pharaoh and the freedom of the Israelites, and how Pharaoh kept, God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and the plagues kept getting worse and worse until finally the firstborn sons of Egypt were murdered. And some of the commentaries on this story talk about how ordinary Egyptians suffered because of the hubris and the tyranny of Pharaoh. And truthfully, there's, I think, and this is sort of a faith in humanity, I think most ordinary Israelis and Palestinians want to live in some sort of peace, just like the guy in Bethlehem. I think most people are pretty decent human beings. They want to have a family, they want to have a job, they want to be able to support their kids, and they want to, have a place to eat and just a decently comfortable life. And there are people on both sides, extremists, who hate each other, and they want power, and they want control. And I think that's probably true in America too.
Yeah,
that's a whole. But the media, exaggerates the extremes, which is their business model. I mean, that's how you get eyeballs. That's how what blood and murder always leads to the news stories. I mean, so I do think in some ways the incentive structure of how we read the news and understand people's points of view is distorted. And that is playing out in the Middle East right now. And so I was listening to this wonderful story on NPR. I think it was on This American Life, and it was about this Palestinian family that is actually, the mother is a journalist and works for Al Jazeera, and they happen to be able to leave to go to Egypt. And like one of the kids just lost their ability to talk. They just, when they got to Egypt, she had gone through so much trauma the last 2 months, and it was just such a powerful story to hear that. And I think so many, just like the Egyptians suffered because of the Pharaoh, so many Palestinians and Israelis are suffering because of these extremes. And I think that is, I don't know what to do with that. I think it's almost somewhat to just constantly kind of affirm that it's almost to keep a faith in humanity. Most people don't want this kind of war. Most people don't want, and we're the majority. And to constantly emphasize that voice, to speak, to work for peace, that I think is the way to deal with it.
I like that answer too. I'm conscious it's about 1:15 now. We're going to open it up for questions. Is there anyone who has a question that they'd like to ask?
So this has come up before in the other contexts, but how do you react when people say religion causes so many problems? What's the value of religion in a world that's so conflicted and so many people point to religion?
Well, okay, I'll go first, I guess.
I like how Tom passes.
He's the
mic.
authority.
I mean,
Yes, that's right.
I at the bottom, in the end, I don't think this conflict is as much about religion. I think that this conflict is more almost about property and about politics and about land and about identity more than it is. Religion is often a few. It is a gloss. It is something that is easily identifiable as a source of conflict. But Jews, if you look at the history, until the 20th century, if you were Jewish, you would much rather live in a Muslim country than a Christian country. There were no crusades in Muslim countries. There was no Inquisition. There was no Holocaust. It was you'd rather live in Morocco or Iraq and there's still Egypt. There were, you weren't equal citizens by any means, but it was a better quality of life. So I think Jews and Muslims generally can get along fine. I think the conflict is religious in the sense that you have two religions with both similar claims to territories. So I think that's on one level that's true. And even in the broader scheme of things about religions causing conflict, this is somewhat, if you go back to sort of Sigmund Freud and so forth, I mean, he would say that there are aggressive instincts within every human being, and that in some ways conflict is often inevitable, and religion is sometimes used as the pretext for that conflict, but these conflicts would happen for other reasons as well: ethnicity, nationality, skin color. So I think religion is not always the source. It's often seems to be, but and especially in this case, I think it's more about land and identity than religion.
And I think the only thing I would add to that is just the word distortion, and I would think that I think a lot of times people will say that about religions, the organizations, and in some ways there's probably some truth to that. I totally agree with what Evan has just said in terms of, probably at the heart of this one is more, land and everything else. But I mean, when you think about it, I mean, there are a lot of people who have lost confidence in us in terms of as a religious institution. But I think they've lost confidence in us because we've messed it up. And we have distorted, I believe, what the original mission is all about. And again, just getting a little bit off the topic, but on the topic. But I mean, it's like when you look at, people's kind of respect for, the Catholic Church. I mean, we've blown it. We've blown it. And we have blown it, and especially with the sexual abuse crisis in the church. Probably the worst crisis that we've ever experienced in the life of the church. And how to rebuild that credibility, I think, is going to be a mammoth task. And we continue to be in a headwind. But, I'm probably getting a little bit off the topic there, David, but I do believe that people's anger or being upset about religions or saying religion is the cause of it, it's the distortion of the institutions. But I do believe, and I think we believe, that at the heart of who we are and the heart of who we should be is good stuff. And good stuff that is guided by our traditions, and good stuff that is guided by the traditions of Judaism and Christianity. At the heart of it, there's good stuff. But when human beings get involved in it and we start talking about power and the abuse of power, that's when things really get screwed up.
So I'm going to just I want to go back to this religion versus land piece, because I think that was as you said, that it was kind of a light bulb moment for me, because I'm thinking, and perhaps many of you in the room, like I feel like as an interfaith family, or as I talk to my Jewish husband, that he feels that it is a religion thing, because people come up to Jews and to interfaith families and say, well, why are you still doing this? Right? As though as though there's some ownership there. So I understand that at the core, this is a land, it's an identity, it's all of those things. But then religion does get put as almost as the wrapper, if you will. So I feel like, and I think part of the reason some of us, people, this group has so many questions about it is because the religious layer or wrapper is so big.
I think that's a very good point. It's a very good point. And I think that is, in some ways, Judaism, again, this is a much larger, Judaism is not a religion. It's not a people. It's not a land. It's all of those, and a culture. Judaism doesn't fit in the traditional categories. Because it's almost, the categories of religion versus people, those are relatively new. I mean, in Greek thought, you have body and soul, and you know, Paul did. But Judaism begins as a people, a clan, the children of Abraham, with a religion. But in some ways, the peoplehood precedes the religion. So there, and the land and the peoplehood are tied together with the religion. So it's all of the above. And I think also the fact that Jews are a small group, that leads people to identify, if you are Jewish in America, you have a connection to Israel, which is true for some and not true for others. But it does paint a broad brush. And in some ways, Israel is so visible. I mean, this is where people on the sort of Israel side would say there's media bias. There are so much attention paid to what's happening in Israel, and there are atrocities happening all over the world, and very little attention is paid to that. And so I think that then leads to people, trying to identify, American Jews with Israel, and it can paint a broad brush, and people can feel attacked, even if they're just, walking around a college campus as a Jewish student.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I'm curious from this group, I mean, do any of you feel when you're being asked about it that you have a personal responsibility, almost, I'm going to call it a personal responsibility, but almost a kind of visceral personal responsibility to respond in defense of Israel? Are you guys finding that in your conversations? I'm seeing some nodding heads. No. I'm just curious, right? Because there's definitely this whole idea of the religion and the religious wrapper, and then associated with it, the anti-Semitism, etc.
I think interfaith families, I think there is a uniquely, I don't know if it's difficult or just unique. There is a dynamic of it's sort of understanding what this conflict means. Because for many people, for some Jews, I would say, it hits a level of trauma and of pain that may be hard to understand for somebody that didn't grow up Jewish. I mean, so I'm 45. When I was and I bet with, at least I know with David, probably some others here, when I was in religious school, like I spent the entire 7th grade was all about the Holocaust. I mean, it was like imbued into your mind about how many people died and were murdered and the trauma that caused. And I think for some, at least on October 7th and the subsequent few days, there was this feeling of, my God, this is traumatic. It brings back, it fits with this narrative that Jews are persecuted and hated. And so that does create a certain sense of pain. I think that may have dissipated over the last few months as the war has played out on television and so forth. But I think that's hard for somebody who didn't grow up with those kind of lessons to relate to. I mean, it's just, and that's nobody's fault. It's just that's how we were wired. And so I think that understanding the pain and the trauma and the connection to Israel, even though we don't live there, maybe haven't even been there, I think that can be a dynamic within interfaith families. Maybe not even so within a couple, but maybe a larger family dinner, like a Thanksgiving dinner or something where people are asking questions. So I think that is a unique dynamic. At least I've had people who've asked me about that. I certainly have had couples who called me in the immediate aftermath. So that might be something. I think that is something that maybe you guys have had to deal with.
I'm going to open it up at any other questions. Any comments?
Anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Well, that's a very complex question. I'll repeat the question. Question is what's the relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism? So I think maybe what you're kind of asking, what a lot of people are asking is being anti-Zionist a form of anti-Semitism? Yeah. I think on an abstract level, no, it's not. So anti-Zionism is the idea that there shouldn't be a Jewish state, that that Judaism in some ways is a religion that can exist without a state, and you can be someone who's opposed to the existence of a Jewish state without being someone who does not like Jews or thinks of Jews as second-class citizens. So on an abstract level, I think, yes, you can be an anti-Zionist and not be anti-Semitic. In fact, in the 1890s, 1880s, there were plenty of Jewish anti-Zionists. However, I think in today's age, it's very difficult because there are 7.5 million Jews living in Israel. So, and so if you are opposed to a Jewish state, I think that said, well, what about these 7.5 million people, who live there? You could say, well, there could be a binational state. And the challenge with that is, well, how can there be peace? How can you feel a sense of safety in a binational state? So I think it's hard. I think in some ways people today are saying, there are many people who are anti-Semitic who are saying, well, I'm just anti-Zionist. And I think that can be true on a very theoretical level, but it's very hard to be true on a practical level today. What's that? River to the, yeah. I think that statement again. On an abstract level, one could see that statement as simply a Palestinian dream of a Palestinian state, but on a practical level, it sort of represents the erasure of Israel. So I think that is it's not again. So many things take on symbolic meaning.
And can you just explain more broadly what that means?
Yeah. So from the river to the sea is a kind of statement that you hear at Palestinian pro-Palestinian folks say, from the river to the sea Palestine will be free, and this idea that there should be a Palestinian state, and from the river to the sea, that's the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. And funny enough, there was some sort of news article I read where a lot of people who were chanting that didn't even know which river and which sea they were referring to. So that's a whole nother. But that just shows how slogans and conflict can become overly simplified. So I think, I'm a believer. I think there should be a Palestinian state. I don't think there will be for a while, but I think in theory there should be two states. And I think if Palestinians have a right, just like there's a right of Jewish sovereignty, there's a right of Palestinian sovereignty. But I think that phrase has come, at least many people perceive that phrase as erasing Israel.
I know we're at the end of the official session. I know that that Evan and Tom have kindly offered to stay, and can have individual conversations if anyone wants to ask them questions after. But for right now, I'm going to thank both of you. This was a really challenging topic, and we always appreciate you coming in and not being afraid to answer the difficult questions. And Tom, we know we put you in a particularly challenging situation because this is something that we should all be talking about. But I think we really do appreciate you being here as well.
Oh, thank you. It's more fun talking about baby naming and baptism than it is
sure.
about this. But,
for sure.
But this is the reality of life. So,
yeah.
But it's good for us to come together and talk.